It's time for another show from Colin Jones, the Reasonable Adventurer. Time for you to take another step towards creating your own opportunities for satisfaction.
And it is a huge welcome to you all to episode 119 of the Reasonable Adventurer. And I'm really excited today to be sharing with you a book that I just keep going in and out of. So it's a book I treat as a reference book because of its scientific grounding. But for the last few years, it's just going back like a yo-yo, back into the book and back out. And the book, it's called 1,000 Brains, A New Theory of Intelligence. It's by Jeff Hawkins, very well-known entrepreneur who invented the Palm Pilot back in the day and has since been really a pioneer in the world of AI and neuroscience. And I've been drawing on his work because as I'm trying to pull together all my thinking for this new step for the Reasonable Adventure, this what we call the primed adventuring. And I'm pulling together the introductory book for that. And it's sort of, by the end of the year, I'll have this book complete. And it's such an exciting project because it's so eclectic. It just draws on just so many perspectives, which is exciting in itself. But it's the interrelationship between these perspectives and how those ideas merge and get brought to life. And that's something that I'm doing as I'm going back and rereading sections and writing new sections in the book. That's one of the really neat things, is about trying to sort of find those things that cut through. And this book cuts through. You know, if you're someone who likes an audio book, it's a brilliant audio book. It's a great book just to have in the background when you're walking and just thinking about your brain, how it works, what that actually means for the way you navigate life. So look, let's get started. The book, I suppose you would say, is equal parts brain science, philosophy, future vision. As I said, it's called 1,000 Brains by Jeff Hawkins. And the book isn't about his gadgets, as in the Palm Pilots. It's about something far more fascinating. It's about how our brains actually work and what it means for that future of artificial intelligence and even consciousness itself. So the book sort of, just to not a spoiler, but the first half of the book is really about how the brain works, and the second half of the book is more to do with what that might mean for AI going forward in the future. So, grab a coffee, settle in, let's explore what makes this book so mind-expanding and how it might change the way you think about your thinking. So the big idea. Hawkins proposes a radical new theory of intelligence, one that moves away from the traditional view of the brain as a single centralized processor. Instead, he argues that intelligence emerges from thousands of models of the world, each built by tiny regions of the neocortex. So specifically the cortical columns. I mean, there's about 150,000 of these cortical columns in the brain. And just so you can sort of start to imagine, when you see that image of the brain, there's essentially a wrap around the neocortex. It's about the size of a big napkin, and that sits right and wraps right around your whole brain. It's about 2.5 mils thick. And so when we talk about a cortical column, we're talking about a column that's about 1 millimeter in diameter and about 2.5 millimeters deep. So everything he's talking about in terms of the process of thinking is happening in each of these little tiny little columns. So imagine your brain not as one big computer, but as 1,000 little ones, each forming its own understanding of reality. And these models, these thousands of models, are constantly comparing notes, voting, and updating the other. That's how we perceive, how we learn, and how we make decisions. And here's where it gets really interesting. Hawkins introduces the concept of reference frames. It's a key idea that helps explain how these mini brains work together. Reference frames are like mental maps. They allow each part of the brain to understand where things are in space and how they relate to each other and how they change over time. So, think of it like a GPS for your thoughts. And this is a big idea for me with primed adventuring, because primed adventuring is essentially about how do we create the mental models that you'll need of the world in order to navigate the world. Okay? So I'm drawing very heavily on the neuroscience of Hawkins and others to be able to explain why would we want to engage in particular self-learning activities in order to be able to free ourselves from anxiety and essentially not being able to navigate an unknown space. So that's where I'm heading with these ideas in terms of the primed adventuring. So how does he build this theory? Well, he starts by walking us through the structure of the neocortex, the sort of the wrinkly outer layer of the brain responsible for everything from language to vision to abstract thought. And he explains that the neocortex is made up of repeating units. Now, this is an idea that he inherited from a very, very smart man, Mountcastle, who many years before wrote a particularly devastating critique of neuroscience, where he actually argued that the brain didn't have all these separate sections for sight and for sensing and for hearing, that it actually was all the same underlying mechanism. It's just that different parts of the brain use that same underlying mechanism to perform different functions. And that was quite a challenging idea at the time. Each of these cortical columns is like a tiny scientist, he argues, forming hypotheses about the world on a sensory input and past experience. These columns don't just process the information, they model it. Now here's where his idea of reference frames comes in. Each column builds its model using a spatial framework, like how your hand knows the shape of a coffee mug by touching it from different angles. I was just trying to work out when's the best time to sort of share my best analogy for this with you. If you're in a shopping centre and you're walking towards an escalator and you hop on the escalator and the escalator's not working, it's uncomfortable, right? You can see it's not working, but your brain still has a whole series of models in it based on your past experiences of escalators, and it expects when your foot lands on the escalator that your foot will be landing on a moving surface. And so your brain has already predicted that and expecting that. And so when that doesn't occur, the models in your brain essentially are disproven in that moment. So we're only aware of the models in our brains that are involved in this prediction when they're proven wrong. Every other moment in our life, all the thousands and thousands of predictions our brain are involved in every day, so long as those predictions come true, there's no issue. We just move on. So, as I said, just like how your hand knows the shape of the coffee mug by touching it from different angles, these reference frames allow the brain to understand objects not just by sight or touch, but by location and movement. Now, Hawkins uses examples like a coffee cup or navigating a room to show how these frames help us to build a 3D understanding of the world. And because each column has its own frame, the brain ends up with multiple overlapping models, hence his focus on this notion of 1,000 brains. This distributed intelligence is what makes us so adaptable. It's why we can recognize a friend's face in different lighting, or understand a metaphor, or learn a new skill. So, okay, All very fascinating, right? How does this help us in our everyday life? Well, once you understand that your brain builds models using reference frames, you can start to train it more effectively. For example, learning a new skill. Break it down into spatial components, whether it's playing a piano or cooking or thinking about how your hands move, how tools relate to each other, and how your body interacts with space. Problem solving. Try shifting your mental reference frame. Look at the issue from different angles, literally and figuratively. This mirrors how your brain naturally compares models. Emotional regulation. And we've talked about that a lot with our subject-object, right? Recognize that your brain is constantly updating its models based on a new input. You can consciously feed it better data, like reframing a stressful situation or practicing mindfulness, to change how you respond. And that's exactly what we were talking about right back at the beginning a few weeks ago when we talked about the issues of pausing and also subject-object rebalancing. And here's a fun one. The next time you're trying to remember something, imagine walking through a familiar space and placing the memory in a specific location. That's called the method of loci. And it works because it taps into your brain's spatial reference frames. So, how does, Hawkins is very good, I think, in giving credit to other people. As I say, Mountcastle is his, divine inspiration in terms of the brain can't have all these different mechanisms. It just has the same mechanism built into each cortical column that just performs different roles, right? So let's think for a minute about how this theory doesn't exist in a vacuum, how it builds on and diverges from ideas by other cognitive scientists and philosophers. For instance, Daniel Kahneman's work on thinking fast and slow explores how we have two systems of thought, one fast and intuitive, the other slow and deliberate. Hawkins' model adds depth by showing how multiple models can support both types of thinking simultaneously. Then there's David Engelman, who talks about the brain as a team of rivals, different neural networks competing and cooperating. Well, Hawkins' Thousand Brains ideas fits beautifully into that framework, offering a structured explanation for how those rivalries actually play out. And if you've read Yuval Noah Harari, you'll see echoes of his ideas about human cognition and storytelling, and how our ability to imagine the model, abstract concepts, sets us apart. Hawkins gives us a neural blueprint for how that actually happens. So, what sort of sets this approach by Hawkins apart? Well, first, he's not just theorizing, he's building. His company, Numeta, is actively developing AI systems based on this particular brain model of how those cortical columns work. That gives his ideas this practical edge. Second, Hawkins doesn't just focus on intelligence. He's touching on consciousness, free will, and even the future of humanity. He argues that understanding the brain's architecture is key to building ethical AI and preserving human values. I think those aims, as lofty as they are most probably tricky to try and work out. It's still a scary space, right? The closer we actually get to understanding the brain, and therefore the closer we get to building these AI systems, it does make one wonder, will it all go the way we want it to? But that's obviously a conversation for another day. And lastly, the emphasis on reference frames is a game changer. It has been for me in my thinking about the brain and how I can help you eventually when we really release all the resources related to primed adventuring. How can we actually help you to become primed for adventure? Most theories of intelligence focus on computational logic. Hawkins says no, it's about location, movement, and prediction. And at some stage we'll come to Andy Clark's book, The Experience Machine, which has big overlap here in terms of the focus on prediction. because prediction is such an important thing for us to think about. And his focus on location, movement, prediction, that is a fresh lens, one that could sort of reshape everything from neuroscience to robotics. So if you're interested, there's lots of other books, I think, that are sort of provide complementary and other media that provides complementary angles on this. I think, obviously, read 1,000 Brains. It's really well written. You can check Hawkins out on YouTube, especially his TED presentations. I think, 17-minute investment will certainly help you to work out whether this is for you. I think the book, The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge, I think that is brilliant just for the range of examples of how we are working with the brain at the moment, and also for emphasizing that there must be this common processing mechanism in all of those cortical columns to enable us to bypass assumed ways in which the brain works. If you haven't read Doidge, he's allowing people to see through their tongue or hear through their tongue, and to rewire the brain. And it's just, that's definitely a book that's worth looking at. You can listen to the podcast Brain Science by Ginger Campbell. Lots of great interviews with thinkers. So, and if you're really into more the science angle on all of this, either from an AI perspective or just the actual technical nature of things, then Numeta's research papers online, they're fascinating as well. So, coming back to our own backyard, how does this all connect to the 6 attributes of the reasonable adventurer? Well, I think in terms of intellectuality, Hawkins embodies this throughout his pursuit of self-authorship, challenging old models and building new ones. His work encourages us to think critically and reflectively. In terms of close friendships, while not a social book per se, the collaborative nature of brain models reminds us that understanding others requires multiple perspectives, just like 1,000 brains, so to speak. So, we can be building the models in our head by having, engagement with other people. The independence in value judgments, well, Hawkins urges us to trust our internal models, not to just default to external authorities. That's the essence of independent thinking. In terms of a tolerance for ambiguity, well, he's arguing that the brain thrives on uncertainty. It's constantly updating its models of the world. So Hawkins shows us that ambiguity isn't a flaw, it's actually a feature. And it's that required input that enables our sense of what the world is to continually update. Think about when you go back to your old schoolyard. You're somewhere you were when you were 6 and 7 or 8, 9, 10 years old. And you go back there and you think, oh my gosh, everything here is so small. I can't believe it. When I was a kid, everything was so big. That's because that particular model of the world, that playground, hasn't been updated since you left there when you were 8 years old. And now when you go back there, your prediction of that area is now being challenged and you can update it, right? In terms of breadth of interest, well, the book spans neuroscience, AI, philosophy, and ethics. And I think Hawkins is a true polymath. His curiosity is contagious. So it really does help us to develop this uncommon interest in the commonplace. And I think the most commonplace thing that we can all be fascinated with is our brain and how we think. And while there's no real sense of humour that sort of pervades through the book, I think Hawkins' humility and clarity make the book very approachable. He doesn't take himself too seriously, and I find that particularly refreshing. So there you have it. 1,000 Brains by Jeff Hawkins, a book that doesn't just explain intelligence, but invites you to rethink how you learn, grow, and interact with the world. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend, leave a review, or drop a message back to me. I'd love to hear from you. in terms of how any of these ideas that we discuss are actually helping you in your own life. And remember, until we meet again, search for adventure everywhere.